Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Now, on today's episode, we'll focus on China's diplomatic activities, namely its involvement in Russia's unlawful aggression against Ukraine. Reports of Beijing being an active supporter of the Kremlin's war machine are not isolated, with the issue raised frequently on the world stage. But now, with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy addressing Beijing's involvement directly, China's supposed geopolitical neutrality may come into question. Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
To say that China has had Russia's back on the international stage would not be a surprise. To say that China has been financially supporting Russia would not be a surprise. To say that Chinese soldiers have been fighting in Ukraine, now that could be a surprise. Kyiv recently reported it captured 2 Chinese nationals fighting for Russia. But that's not all.
We also have data on other Chinese nationals serving in Russia's army, names, surnames, and documented recruitment paths. We will pass this information to the Chinese authorities through diplomatic channels.
Zelenskyy says that at least 155 Chinese citizens are engaged in combat on Russia's behalf. This is the first time Kyiv has made such a serious allegation towards Beijing since the start of the war. As of now, China has responded with a less than pleased comment from its foreign ministry.
We would advise the relevant parties to recognize China's role correctly and clear-headedly, and to refrain from expressing irresponsible remarks.
Beijing has also said that it bars its citizens from participating in any conflict. Zelenskyy claims that Russia recruits Chinese citizens for the war through social media, and that Chinese authorities are aware of this. The presence of Chinese nationals in the war is not the first time that Russia has used foreign citizens in its war. North Korea reportedly sent some 10,000 troops to support Moscow's efforts in pushing Ukrainian soldiers out of the Kursk region.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Just as Ukraine is not alone in its fight, so does Russia have its share of supportive partners. China, in particular, is a curious case, as Beijing has been openly declaring neutrality while stuffing greenbacks into Moscow's back pocket when no one is looking.
At its core, China is a mercantile powerhouse. Where there is good business to be made, no matter which part of the world, you can count on Beijing to keep an eye on that place. It is no different in the case of the war in Ukraine. When the West slapped sanction upon sanction on Russia for its invasion, China was more than willing to step in and replace as much Western presence in Russia as it could. For the better part of a decade, Russia and China have been growing closer and closer with each passing year. While it hasn't done something as ostensible as send troops into Russia for frontline support, China has been helping finance its war effort. China has become a primary consumer of Russian energy, and energy revenue is one of the most important ways Moscow pays for its armies. Trade between the two powers has been surging year on year since the invasion's beginning. To top that off, leading Chinese banks from the so-called Big Four have been lending more money to Russia since the conflict's outbreak. There are even official financing mechanisms between Moscow and Beijing in place, the Russia-China Investment Fund. Established in 2012, it has been a channel for financial cooperation even during the war. Military-wise, no, Beijing hasn't really lifted a finger to help Russia. Money-wise, it seems to have been using its entire financial arm to help.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. Tensions are rising between Kyiv and Beijing as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy accused China of covertly aiding Russia in its war effort. According to President Zelenskyy, 155 Chinese nationals have been identified as fighting alongside Russian forces, with 2 recently captured in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. This marks Kyiv's first formal claim that China is supplying manpower to Moscow. Zelenskyy alleges the fighters received training in Moscow before deployment and were recruited via social media, with Chinese authorities aware of their involvement. Now, Beijing has firmly denied the accusations. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jiang dismissed Zelenskyy's claims as unfounded, insisting that China is not a party to the conflict. Now, what was emphasized in that statement was that the government of China explicitly prohibits its citizens from participating in foreign military operations, and it was also suggested that any such involvement is personal and a violation of official Chinese policy. Now, despite China's denials, the situation has intensified international scrutiny of Beijing's role in the war. Ukraine has long questioned China's supposed neutrality, noting the export of dual-use technology and materials that could bolster Russia's military capabilities. Washington has labeled the reports of Chinese nationals fighting in Ukraine disturbing, amplifying calls for accountability and transparency. As Ukraine urges its allies to respond firmly, the allegations raise new concerns about the global dimension of the conflict and the growing alliance between Moscow and Beijing. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Rostislav Khotin, senior Ukrainian editor with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello.
So the Chinese troops or Chinese citizens in Ukraine fighting on the Russian side, how serious is this situation?
It's serious because for the first time the Chinese citizens were taken as prisoners of war by Ukrainian troops. And the thing is that if you compare Chinese citizens fighting against Ukraine with North Koreans fighting against Ukraine, there is a significant difference between these two cases, because North Koreans were taken prisoners of war and were fighting and still are fighting against Ukraine on the territory of Russian Federation proper, of the territory of the very Russian Federation in Kursk region, where Ukrainians conducted their operations since August last year. But two Chinese prisoners of war were taken, were captured by Ukrainian troops in the Donetsk region, in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine proper, which is formerly territory of sovereign Ukrainian state. So there is difference. Another difference is that we are confident that North Koreans were sent to fight against Ukraine by Kim Jong-un, North Korean dictator. They are officially soldiers of the North Korean army, of the communist, this dictatorship. They are official soldiers. With Chinese, it's not clear. The principle, the crucial question is whether they are just volunteers, whether they are just mercenaries fighting for money, or for other reasons like taking Russian passports or have a right to settle in Russia, or whether they are soldiers of the National Army National Liberation Army of Chinese People's Republic.
Well, that's a crucial issue, isn't it? Right? That's absolutely the most important thing to determine right now. President Zelenskyy indicated there may be more Chinese citizens fighting on the Russian side. The number stated was around 150. We do have these two who are captured right now, and as you said. Would you say it is more likely that they were there simply because they wanted to, because they were somehow induced to join in with the Russian forces, or perhaps they might have actually been given the sort of tacit permission from the authorities? Do you think it's possible to do something like that in China without the authorities knowing about it and giving you the green light, essentially?
You know, taking into account the nature, the essence of Chinese state, where it's one-party rule with Communist Party of China ruling and having established tight control over its citizens and over the whole country. I don't think it was quite a surprise for Chinese authorities that Chinese are fighting against Ukraine for Russian army in Ukraine. I don't think it's a surprise for the official Beijing, although they requested immediately, Foreign Ministry of China requested immediately more information from Ukrainian authorities. But nevertheless, you know, with such numbers of dozens and dozens of Chinese nationals fighting against Ukraine for Russia, and Zelenskyy even put the number as 150 or 155, at least even more, maybe, Chinese fighting against Ukraine. I don't think with such a tight control over Chinese population from the authorities of this tightly controlled state, I don't think that Chinese authorities didn't know that Chinese were fighting for Russia against Ukraine, and maybe reasons were different. These two prisoners of war who were captured by Ukrainian troops. They were interrogated and still are in captivity of Ukrainian security service. According to some reports, they were lured by the money, by the payment Russia has promised to them. Also, one of them was lured by the promise of settlement in Russia and Russian citizenship of the Russian Federation. So they might be not 100% soldiers of the Chinese army, but nevertheless, I don't think that there are no kind of Chinese, let's say, spies or people with a special mission fighting against Ukraine for Russia in Ukraine, that they are not supplying information to Chinese armed forces about the nature of the war, about the state of Russian Federation army, about the morale, about the new tendencies, trends in the war, like drones and so on and so forth. China is very much interested in this kind of information, and who is the best place to provide this information from the first-hand experience are Chinese nationals fighting for Russia against Ukraine, about the state of Russian army, about the nature and trends of modern war, about the very war between Ukraine and Russia, what kind of war, what type of war is this, what kind of direction is developing to, and so on and so forth. So China is very much interested in this information. I'm sure, I'm just confident that among these 150 plus Chinese nationals fighting for Russia against Ukraine, there are lots of informers who were placed there by China to feed with this information, which is of crucial importance for the Chinese army and Chinese state.
So let's talk about China's response to these accusations. The first thing they said, don't read too much into it, don't draw any conclusions. Second thing they said, our citizens are not allowed to fight in foreign armed forces, period. This is basically a banned activity. And then we also had the testimonies from the captured soldiers themselves. Now, one of them apparently said that he was literally a rookie, that he never fired a gun before, that he was accompanied by another Russian soldier. They were captured together, but he was not an experienced operator. At least this is what he says. Do you think that all those statements and narratives coming both from the authorities and from the interested persons themselves are to be believed?
You know, we don't know, because the Chinese are very difficult to interrogate, to trust. They are kind of, they have their own mind. It's difficult even in the world of special services. It's difficult to recruit Chinese because they are not kind of reliable. They switch easily to Chinese language and they don't understand you immediately if they want to pretend they don't understand what you're talking about. So that's one thing. Secondly, these captured prisoners of war from China, they might be volunteers, they might be mercenaries, we don't know. But as I said, I'm sure that among those 150 plus Chinese nationals fighting for Ukraine, China was aware of this fact, and it's one of the biggest contingents, because a lot of others are fighting for Russia against Ukraine, like Venezuelans, Cubans, North Koreans. They are a separate case, as we mentioned, but people from Africa, Nigeria, and so on and so forth, Vietnamese, different nationalities. But this contingent of Chinese nationals in Ukraine, according to Zelenskyy, 150 plus, it's the biggest, one of the biggest contingents of foreigners fighting for Russia. And I'm sure with tightly controlled Chinese atmosphere in their country, I'm sure the Chinese authorities were aware about this fact. Secondly,
don't you think it's going to be damaging for China in terms of its reputation as a country that wants to show itself as a neutral party, as a country that is capable of bringing the two warring sides together, perhaps acting as a mediator? This is the way that the Chinese government was positioning themselves in this conflict. They were saying, we're neutral, we want Ukraine to maintain its sovereignty, but also we want the Russian interests there to be maintained. Do you think that this is likely to derail this narrative, i.e. that by proving perhaps that these troops were there with the consent of the authorities in Beijing, or at least that there is a reasonable suspicion that they were, that Beijing will no longer be able to use this narrative when talking to other partners on the international stage?
Yeah, from the day one of this war, full-fledged invasion of Russia into Ukraine in 2022, China portrayed itself as the neutral player, despite having providing 80% of dual-use goods to Russia, which Russia uses for military production, and generally supporting politically Russia and economically buying cheaply Russian oil and so on and so forth. But China nevertheless tried to distance from both sides, tried to portray itself as a neutral player, mediator even. We remember very well a Chinese peace plan, so-called, which consisted of 10 points, which actually never mentioned war as war. China always portrayed this Russian aggression as Ukrainian crisis, vaguely kind of, neutral term, Ukrainian crisis, whatever it means. China never said that we support territorial integrity of Ukraine. In peace plan of China and in joint peace plan of China and Brazil, which appeared later, China always says we support territorial integrity and sovereignty of all countries of the world, not mentioning Ukraine by name at all. So now with the Chinese nationals being captured in Ukraine, with more information coming about lots of many Chinese nationals fighting against Ukraine in Russia, it's difficult to portray for China to kind of portray itself as a distant, neutral player, and Ukraine was very clearly trying to make a point, saying that China should kind of do something in order to be more neutral, and that China is no longer kind of accepted as a mediator. But we also have to admit that lately, for quite a long time already, China has the Chinese peace efforts, especially when with the new American administration and attempt by Washington to play mediating role, Chinese efforts to be a mediator ceded.
Rostov Sachotin was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. The so-called Coalition of the Willing is facing some serious hurdles as it attempts to put together security guarantees for Ukraine. The lack of US commitment to the project, Bloomberg reports, makes matters rather difficult for the Franco-British-led group to come up with specific ideas.
So far, the ceasefire talks involving the United States, Russia and Ukraine have been fruitless. This is because Moscow continues to stall the talks by putting forward various conditions that are deemed unacceptable by Ukraine. Europe has been trying to garner support to create what French President Macron called a reassurance force, intended to help upkeep a possible future ceasefire. This idea has been taken seriously by European NATO members. Just yesterday, they discussed proposals for ensuring Ukrainian safety in the wake of a ceasefire at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. Since the start of the war, however, it is the United States that has been the main muscle behind military aid for Ukraine. The new administration under Donald Trump does not seem too eager to flex this muscle any longer and has not offered Ukraine any clear security guarantees. Nor has it shown interest in supporting the coalition of the willing. While the British side insists that some sort of US contribution is necessary to ensure the coalition's success, France has said that the reassurance force plan will go ahead with or without the US. For now, at least 37 countries have been involved in coalition talks. 15 of them are reportedly ready to contribute troops.
Another side to all the buzz surrounding support for Ukraine is the minerals deal that the US wants to sign with Kyiv. A new round of negotiations has reportedly been set to take place in Washington on the 11th and the 12th of April.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
Relations between Washington and Kyiv since Donald Trump returned to the White House have been much more sour than they have been sweet. One of the most important issues that both sides have been grappling with is the so-called minerals deal. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says, on the eve of a new round of talks, that there must be equal ownership of extraction revenue between both sides as part of the agreement. Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal points out that such a deal must comply with the country's constitution and not conflict with Ukraine's future EU membership. The deal initially involved Ukraine having to contribute 50% of profits from future resource extraction to repay the military aid the US provided since 2022. As exchanges between Ukrainian and American officials have become heated, a revised edition has been put forward, which increased the contribution to 100% with a 4% annual interest before Ukraine is able to access any profits. The deal's future is uncertain. It has been dubbed colonial style and harshly criticized by some Ukrainian lawmakers and commentators.
As Ukrainian officials are struggling with their American counterparts to get security guarantees, the war has done anything but stop. The Ukrainian Interior Ministry warns that Russia has been using drones to drop explosives all across Ukraine.
Civilian areas have been targeted by Russia since the start of its invasion of Ukraine. The latest way in which the Russians are doing this is by having drones scatter explosive devices all over the country. These, Ukrainian authorities say, are particularly dangerous, as they do not always appear to be explosives, and the timing of their detonations is unknown. Ukrainian civilians have been asked to report any suspicious objects that they find lying around, and under no circumstances should they be approached. Ukrainian technicians are working around the clock to analyze the devices that have been captured, to see whether some sort of countermeasures can be developed, and provide further public guidance.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.